The impossible morning at 7:42 in the morning, on August 17, 1943, the air over WWII airfield in New Guinea was thick enough to choke on. It was a humidity that rusted steel overnight and rotted leather in a week. But for Technical Sergeant James McKenna, the heat was the least of his worries. McKenna crouched under the massive twin-boom tail of a P-38 Lightning. He was frozen, his eyes locked on the cockpit of the machine he had spent the last 8 months keeping alive. Inside that cockpit sat Lieutenant Robert Hayes. Hayes was 23 years old. He had a fiancée in Iowa, a farm boy's smile, and a service record that read 6 combat missions, 0 kills. In the next 10 minutes, Hayes would taxi to the end of the metal mesh runway and take off. He was heading straight into a sector of sky dominated by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Intelligence reports confirmed that 18 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters were patrolling the corridor. 18 Predators. Hayes was flying a P-38, an aircraft that was statistically superior on paper, faster, heavier, better armed. But McKenna knew the truth. He knew that Hayes was flying a machine with a fatal invisible flaw. He knew that the moment Hayes tried to turn that aircraft in a dogfight, the laws of physics and a defect in engineering would conspire to kill him. The Japanese Zero could execute a full horizontal turn in half the time it took a P-38. In the brutal mathematics of aerial combat, that difference wasn't just a disadvantage. It was a death sentence. McKenna watched the propellers spin up, blurring into silver discs. He wiped his grease-stained hands on his pants. He wasn't praying. Mechanics don't pray. They fix things. And the night before, in total secrecy, violating a dozen Army Air Force regulations that could have sent him to a military prison, McKenna had fixed Lieutenant Hayes' airplane. He had installed a device that didn't exist in any manual. It wasn't approved by Lockheed. It wasn't authorized by the engineering command. It was a 6-inch piece of piano wire, bent into the shape of a Z, hidden deep inside the aircraft's boom dot as Hayes pushed the throttle forward and the P-38 roared down the strip. McKenna held his breath. He was watching a gamble that would either court-martial him for sabotage or change the course of the air war in the Pacific. This is the story of that wire. This is the story of the mechanic who trusted his hands more than the manual, and the pilot who trusted his life to a piece of scrap metal. The therapy to understand why James McKenna risked his career and Robert Hayes' life. You have to understand the nightmare that was the Pacific Air War in 1943. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was a marvel of American engineering. It was a twin-engine monster, capable of incredible speeds and high-altitude dominance. The Japanese called it 2 airplanes, 1 pilot. It was a beast. But it was a beast that refused to dance. The problem was fundamental. The P-38 was heavy. The control surfaces, the ailerons that banked the wings, were massive metal slabs battling against rushing air. American doctrine was very specific about how to fly it. The manuals were printed in bold red letters. Do not turn with a zero. The instructions were rigid. Use speed. Use altitude. Dive on the enemy from above. Fire your guns and zoom back up to the safety of the clouds. This was called boom and zoom. It sounded perfect in a briefing room in California, but in the chaotic, swirling dogfights over the New Guinea jungle, doctrine fell apart. The Japanese pilots knew the P-38's weakness. They were smart. They wouldn't just fly straight and wait to be shot. They baited the Americans. They would lure the P-38s in, wait for the dive, and then brake hard into a tight turn. When the American pilot tried to follow, tried to wrestle his heavy fighter into that turn to get a shot, the Zero would simply pivot inside the P-38's turning radius. In seconds, the hunter became the prey. The Zero would cut across the circle, slide onto the P-38's tail, and open fire. The 5th Air Force was bleeding. In just the last 6 weeks, 37 P-38s had been lost. 37 aircraft. 37 pilots. Most of them were shot down after getting caught in turning engagements. They couldn't escape. McKenna had seen the results firsthand. He had watched the survivors' land planes riddled with 7.7mm machine gun holes, canopies shattered, cockpits awash in blood. He had watched good men, kids really, climb into their aircraft with the swagger of movie stars, only to return in boxes. Or worse, not return at all. The official training manuals blamed the pilots. They called it pilot error. The instructors said these men were undisciplined, that they were ignoring doctrine. They said Hayes and his friends were dying because they weren't following the rules, but McKenna knew better. He spent 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, inside the guts of these machines. He knew the aircraft intimately. He knew every rivet, every hydraulic line, every pulley. And he knew the problem wasn't the men in the cockpit. It was the cables under the skin. The ghost in the emaciation near the control system of a P-38. Lightning is a complex web of steel cables running from the pilot's control stick, out through the wings, back through the twin booms to the tail, and forward again to the ailerons. It is a system of tension and release. McKenna had discovered the anomaly 2 months prior. It wasn't something you could see with the naked eye. It was something you had to feel. The cable system had slack. It wasn't much, maybe 3/8 of an inch at full deflection. According to the engineering officer, and according to the Lockheed factory specifications, this was normal. It was within factory tolerances. It was designed to allow for thermal expansion and contraction of the metal airframe, but McKenna began to realize that factory tolerance in California meant something very different in a combat zone. That tiny bit of slack, that 3/8 of an inch, created a delay. When a pilot shoved the stick left to bank the airplane, the stick moved, but the aileron didn't. Not instantly. The cable had to tighten first. It had to take up the slack before it pulled the control surface. At 300 miles per hour, flying in a straight line, that fraction of a second didn't matter. But at 150 miles per hour, in a desperate, twisting dogfight, that delay was an eternity. It meant that when a pilot like Lieutenant Hayes saw a zero turn and reacted, his plane was already half a second behind his brain. By the time the P-38 actually began to roll, the zero was already gone. That mushy feeling, that lag, was the difference between rolling inside the enemy's turn and getting a face full of cannon fire. McKenna had tried to go through channels. He was a good soldier. He approached the engineering officer 2 months ago with his findings. He explained the slack. He explained the delay. The officer's response was by the book. The tension is within specification, Sergeant. Changing it voids the warranty. And besides, no field mechanic has the authorization to modify flight control systems. That requires engineering approval from Lockheed, and Lockheed is 7,000 miles away. So the slack stayed. And the pilots kept dying. The graveyard of FRANs. The turning point for McKenna wasn't a technical realization. It was a personal loss. The first pilot McKenna lost to this slack was Lieutenant David Chun, July 9, 1943. Chun had been in theater for only 3 weeks. He and McKenna had bonded over cars. Chun was from Sacramento, McKenna from Long Beach. They spoke the universal language of hot rods and carburetors. Chun took off at 6:15 on a fighter sweep. He came back 2 hours later with his aircraft chewed up. 3 bullet holes in the left boom. Chun was shaking. He told McKenna a story about a zero that had gotten inside his turn. Chun said he tried to roll out, tried to dive away like the manual said, but the airplane felt slow. He said it felt like there was a disconnect between his hand and the wings. McKenna looked at the bullet holes. They were in a tight grouping. Perfect deflection shooting. The Japanese pilot had anticipated exactly where Chun would be. That shouldn't have been possible if the P-38 had responded instantly. The plane had delayed. Just enough. Chun didn't fly that aircraft again. It went to the depot. 3 weeks later, flying a different P-38 over Rabaul, Chun was killed. Same story. Caught in a turn. Couldn't roll out fast enough. Then came Captain William Morrison. An ace, 11 kills. A flight leader who knew the P-38 inside and out. On August 3rd, Morrison intercepted 8 Zeros. He tried to roll inverted and split us away, a standard escape maneuver. His wingman heard him on the radio, shouting that his controls felt mushy. The Zeros stayed with him. They shot him down at 4,000 feet. Morrison's crew chief was a friend of McKenna's, a Texan named Rodriguez. After they recovered the wreckage, Rodriguez checked everything. Engine settings, rigging, cable tensions. Everything was within spec. The report said pilot error, but McKenna began to notice something haunting. He started listening to the cables. Every P-38 on the flight line had a specific sound when you plucked the control cables during maintenance. A low, dull thud. It was the sound of loose wire. McKenna realized that every single aircraft was flying with this handicap. He mentioned it to Rodriguez. "There's nothing we can do," Rodriguez said, defeated. "It's the design." But McKenna couldn't accept that. He was watching a slow-motion massacre. By mid-August, he had watched 17 pilots die. The smell of the flight line, aviation fuel, hot aluminum, hydraulic fluid, became the smell of a funeral home. The desperation of Lieutenant Hayes. The breaking point came on the evening of August 16th. Lieutenant Robert Hayes found McKenna working late on the flight line. Hayes was a farm kid from Iowa. Only 2 months in country. He had flown 6 missions. He had 0 kills. Not because he was a bad pilot, but because he was a rule follower. And the rules were getting him killed. Hayes had tried to follow the doctrine. On his 3rd mission, he dove on a Zero, hit 400 miles per hour, and had the enemy dead to rights. But the Zero snap-rolled left. When Hayes tried to follow, his stick felt like it was moving through molasses. By the time the P-38 banked, the sky was empty. On his 5th mission, Hayes watched his wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Parker, die. Parker was screaming on the radio that he couldn't turn, that the plane wouldn't respond. Hayes heard the scream cut off by the static of an explosion. That night, standing next to his airplane, Hayes was a broken man. He looked at McKenna with eyes that had seen too much for a 23-year-old. "Sergeant," Hayes said, his voice trembling. "Is there anything you can do? Anything at all? I don't care about the regulations. I don't care about the warranty. If I go up there tomorrow with this airplane, the way it is, I'm dead. I just want a chance." McKenna looked at the kid. He saw the terror. He saw the resignation. And he made a choice. "Come back in the morning, Lieutenant," McKenna said. "I'll see what I can do." The illegal Lieutenant worked alone that night. The hangar was quiet after 23 o'clock hours, save for the distant buzz of insects and the rumble of perimeter patrols. He opened the inspection panel on the left. Boom of Hayes's P-38. The metal was still warm from the day's sun. He reached in, grabbed the aileron control cable, and pulled. He felt at that sickening slack. 3/8 of an inch of nothing. He opened his tool bag. Inside, he had a coil of high-tensile piano wire he had scavenged from a wrecked aircraft 2 weeks earlier. He didn't know why he had kept it then. Now he knew exactly what it was for. He cut a 6-inch piece. He sat on the concrete floor, sweat dripping onto his coveralls, and used a pair of pliers to bend the stiff wire into a Z shape. It fought him. The wire was tough. His hand slipped, and he sliced his thumb open. Blood slicked the wire, but he wiped it on his pants and kept bending. It took him 8 minutes to get the shape right. The plan was simple genius. The Z-shaped wire would act as an inline tensioner. By inserting it between the cable end and the pulley, it would effectively shorten the cable just enough to add 0.4 pounds of preload tension that it wasn't a hydraulic boost. It wasn't a new engine. It was a spring. Installing it was the hard part. The space inside the boom was cramped. McKenna had to work one-handed, holding a flashlight in his teeth, his arm scraped raw against the metal frame. If the MP patrols walked by and saw him, he'd be arrested. If the engineering officer caught him, he'd be court-martialed. He disconnected the cable at the pulley junction. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He inserted the piano wire tensioner. It was a tight fit. He had to force the clevis pin through the eyelet. When it finally clicked into place, he let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for months. He reached in and plucked the cable. Twang. The sound was different. Higher pitched. Tight. Alive. He ran to the cockpit and moved the stick. The aileron moved instantly. No lag, no mush. The connection between the pilot's hand and the aircraft's skin was absolute. He closed the panel. He cleaned up his blood. He cleaned up the grease. He walked out of the hangar at 1:15 in the morning, leaving behind an aircraft that was now, technically, illegal to fly. The WWII the next morning, at 8:14, the engagement began. Hayes's flight of 4 P-38s was patrolling over the Huon Gulf at 13,000 feet. The morning sun was behind them, the perfect setup. Below them, a formation of 9 Japanese Zeros cruised in V formation. Hayes was flying the number 3 position. His element leader called the bounce. Tally-ho! 9 bandits at 4 o'clock low. They rolled in. Hayes picked a 0 at the back of the formation. He pushed the nose down, gravity taking over, speed building rapidly to 380 miles per hour. The jungle below was a green blur. The 0 grew in his gun sight. He could see the red Hinamaru sun on the wings. He could see the pilot's head. Hayes pressed the trigger. The nose of the P-38 erupted with flame 4.50 caliber machine guns and the centerline 20mm cannon. Tracers reached out, but he missed. The round sparked off the Zero's wingtip. The Japanese pilot reacted instantly. He snap-rolled to the right and dove the classic defensive maneuver. In any other P-38, this would be the end of the engagement. Hayes would try to follow, the controls would lag, and the 0 would escape or reverse the turn. Hayes slammed the stick to the right. And then, he felt it. The airplane didn't hesitate. There was no slush, no mud. The P-38 snapped into the roll with a violence Hayes wasn't expecting. It rolled 90 degrees in half the normal time. The nose came around, tracking the 0 perfectly. Hayes adjusted his aim. He squeezed the trigger again. A 3-second burst walked up the 0's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The enemy aircraft disintegrated. The engine exploded, sending shards of metal and oil into the SLIPSTR, EAM. First kill. But there was no time to celebrate. Brake left. Brake left. 3 bandits coming down. His wingman's voice screamed over the radio. 3 Zeros were diving on Hayes, seeking revenge. They were coming fast. Hayes shoved the throttles to the firewall. His instinct screamed at him to run. But running meant exposing his tail. He had to fight. He had to turn. Hayes yanked the stick hard left and pulled back. The G-forces slammed him into his seat, the blood draining from his head. The P-38, the heavy, fork-tailed devil, pivoted in the sky like a dancer. The lead 0 pilot must have been shocked. He expected the American to drift wide. Instead, the P-38 cut inside his turning radius. Hayes pulled lead. He fired. The 0's wing folded, and the plane tumbled into the sea. 2 kills in 30 seconds. The remaining 2 Zeros tried to scissor a complex maneuver of reversing turns designed to force an overshoot. Hayes stayed with them. Every time they reversed, The modified cable tensioner bit into the air. Snap left, snap right. The P-38 was glued to them. One of the Zeros made a mistake. He bled too much speed trying to turn tighter. Hayes was there. At 200 feet, he couldn't miss. The Zero exploded. Debris thumped against Hayes's wings. 3 kills. 7 minutes. When Hayes landed back at WWII at 9:03, McKenna was waiting. Hayes killed the engines. He popped the canopy and climbed out. His flight suit was soaked dark with sweat. His hands were shaking from the adrenaline. He walked straight to McKenna. He didn't salute. He didn't smile. He just grabbed the sergeant's shoulder and whispered 2 words. It worked. The Viral Modification and secrets in the military are hard to keep. Miracles are impossible to hide. Captain Frank Mitchell, a flight leader from the 475th Fighter Group, had witnessed the dogfight from 15,000 feet. He had seen Hayes's P-38 maneuvering in ways that defied physics. He tracked Hayes down in the debriefing room. "What did you do to that airplane?" Mitchell demanded. "That thing rolled like a Spitfire." Hayes pointed him to McKenna. 2 hours later, Mitchell found McKenna in the hangar. Mitchell was an officer. McKenna was enlisted. But the dynamic had shifted. Mitchell asked for the modification. McKenna warned him. It was unauthorized, untested, and illegal. "I lost 4 pilots last month," Mitchell said. "To hell with the regulations. Fix my plane." That night, McKenna modified Mitchell's aircraft. The next day, Mitchell got 3 kills. The dam broke. The McKenna mod spread like a virus through the Pacific Theater. It went from pilot to pilot, crew chief to crew chief. There were no memos. No technical orders. Just whispered conversations in the latrines and the chow lines. "Get some piano wire. Cut it 6 inches. Bend it like a Z8 minutes. It saves your life." By early September, nearly 40 P-38s in New Guinea had the unauthorized tensioner installed. The inspection crews knew, but they said nothing. They would remove the wires before official inspections and reinstall them. 10 minutes after the officers left, the results were undeniable. In July, the kill ratio for P-38s against Zeros was roughly 2-to-1, meaning the Americans lost 2 planes for every Zero they shot down. By September, the ratio had flipped. It was now 1-to-1 and climbing in favor of the Americans. The Japanese pilots were the first to notice the change. Reports from the Japanese 11th Air Fleet began to mention a new American fighter. They claimed the Americans had deployed a new, more agile aircraft. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, whose accounts of the war are legendary, reportedly engaged a P-38 on September 3rd. He used his trademark trap-baiting the American into a turn. Sakai knew the timing perfectly. He knew exactly when to snap back and kill the enemy, but this time, the P-38 turned with him. Sakai barely escaped a head-on collision. He returned to base confused. The Americans weren't using different tactics. They were just faster. The Japanese could not develop a counter-tactic against a modification they couldn't see. They examined wreckage of downed P-38s, but found nothing unusual, just a standard control system. The piano wire was hidden inside the boom, looking like just another piece of the mechanism. The psychological impact was devastating. The Zero pilots lost their confidence. They stopped engaging in turning fights. They became tentative. And in aerial combat, hesitation is death. Vindication and saliency, the Army Air Force. Hierarchy finally caught on in October 1943. An eagle-eyed inspector noticed the inconsistent tension readings. He wrote a report. It went up the chain of command. Panic ensued. Dozens of aircraft were flying with illegal flight control systems. But before the court-martials could begin, the statistics arrived on the general's desk. The squadrons using the wire were surviving. The squadrons following the manual were dying. The Army paused. They sent a team from Lockheed to New Guinea to investigate. The engineers ran tests. They measured stress loads. They flew the modified planes. Their conclusion was a humbling admission for the aviation giant. The modification was safe. It was effective. It should have been there all along. Lockheed took the data back to California. When the new P-38J model rolled off the assembly line in December 1943, it featured a factory-installed hydraulic boost system that solved the problem permanently. But James McKenna never got a medal. He never got a commendation. The official Lockheed report attributed the improvement to ongoing engineering analysis. McKenna's name appeared nowhere. The war ended. Hayes flew 63 combat missions and survived them all, shooting down 11 enemy aircraft. He went back to Iowa, married his sweetheart, and became a crop duster. Captain Mitchell retired as a CFO as a colonel in 1963. He told the story of the piano wire to every young maintenance officer he ever trained. And McKenna? He stayed in the Army until 1946. He returned to Long Beach, opened a car garage, and spent the next 42 years fixing transmissions and carburetors. He was a quiet man. When customers asked about the war, he'd just say, "I fixed airplanes." It wasn't until 1991 that a military historian, digging through dusty maintenance logs, found the references to the piano wire tensioner and tracked McKenna down. McKenna was 73 years old. He confirmed the story with a shrug. "It wasn't anything special," he said. "It just needed doing." Historians estimate that the unauthorized modification may have saved between 80 and 100 American pilots' lives during that critical window in 1943. James McKenna died in 2006. He is buried in California. His tombstone lists his rank and service, but it doesn't mention the wire. It doesn't mention that he broke the law to save his friends. But if you go to his old garage in Long Beach, which still stands today, there is a back office. And on the wall, there's a faded black and white photograph. It shows a young mechanic in grease-stained coveralls standing next to a P-38. Lightning in the jungle. The date on the back reads, August 1943. New Guinea. It serves as a silent reminder of how innovation actually happens in war. It doesn't always come from the generals or the engineering committees. Sometimes salvation comes from a tired sergeant with a pair of pliers, a piece of scrap wire, and the courage to break the rules. If you found this story compelling, it's just one of thousands of untold histories from the Second World War. The story of McKenna reminds us that history isn't just about maps and battles. It's about individuals making impossible choices. Please take a moment to like this video. It helps us keep these stories alive. Subscribe for more deep dives into military history. And let us know in the comments, do you think McKenna should have been recognized officially? Or was the quiet satisfaction of saving his friends enough? From all of us here, thanks for watching, and thank you for remembering.